Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. I'm Trish Ehlers with FBA. Gary will be joining us shortly. We are now in our 29th episode of 2023, and I would like to thank our sponsor, Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast. Last week in Washington, D.C., FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel responded to a letter from Senators Wicker, Hyde-Smith, and Vance. In the senators' letter, they highlighted that RDOF Phase 1 had a budget of $16 billion. While $9.2 billion was awarded in the RDOF auction, only $6 billion was actually authorized. So the senators believed that the FCC had $10 billion sitting on the sidelines, and that some of that money could be deployed to the network operators with RDOF projects to help offset the high cost builds from inflation and supply chain issues and so forth. In the chairwoman's response, she explained that while RDOF was slated to have a budget of $20.4 billion, that money is not sitting in reserves. The funding actually came from USEF contributions, as only $6 billion have been committed. Thus, the USEF contribution factor was adjusted for the $6 billion. This explanation is very enlightening, as I too thought that the FCC had $14 billion of dry powder that could be deployed for further RDOF or ACP. It also explains why the USF contribution factor is so high. Also last week, the U.S. Senate Committee of Commerce, Science, and Transportation approved the nominations for Ana Gomez to fill the open commission seat at the FCC, along with approving the nominations for incumbent FCC Commissioner Starks and Carr. These nominations will now be sent to the Senate floor. I believe Gary is with us, and I'll let him take over from here.
All right, thanks, Trish. And sorry, I think I had a little computer crash here, but yeah. So hey, we have our Fiber Connect 2023 in Orlando's and August 20th and 23rd. We're 5 weeks out, and we're completely sold out at the hotel at the Gaylord Palms, but we just opened up reservations at the Delta Hotels by Marriott, which is just around the corner. So if you haven't registered yet, please do so, because the Delta will sell out soon. And then today at 11 Eastern, I'll be hosting Where's the Funding with our guest, Chris Perez, the Municipal Capital Markets Group, and he will be discussing tapping municipal markets. You're not going to want to miss that, so please register. And then lastly, we have our final Regional Fiber Connect workshop in Minneapolis on October 24th. Registration is open, so please, we'll see you in Minneapolis. With that, it finally brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session with our good friend Ryan Koontz, Manager Director and Senior Research Analyst at Needham. And Ryan's going to discuss federal funding and economic impacts on the fiber broadband industry. But before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers, whose team is going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary. Good morning to everyone who's joined us today. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if you'd all just keep in mind that you're in listen mode only. To ask a question, you just need to type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a very brief feedback survey. Please take a minute to do that. We do appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Well, thanks, Trish. And good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, we had the pleasure of hearing from top industry research analyst Julie Kunstler of Omnia Informa, who discussed the North American PON equipment and vendor market. You know, Julie's always a wealth of information and industry insights. Today on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is Ryan Koontz, the Managing Director and Senior Research Analyst at Needham. And Ryan's going to discuss federal funding and the economic impacts in the fiber industry. Ryan joined Needham & Company as Managing Director and Senior Analyst in 2021, covering broadband networking and cloud communications equity sectors. Before Needham, Ryan covered cloud communications and network sector at Rosenblatt Securities for 3 years, and previously founded 2 independent research businesses at Woodside Capital and Inflection Point Research. Before equity research, Ryan held key management positions at AFC, Ericsson, and AT&T, developing fiber access products. Ryan holds a BS in electrical engineering, an MBA and MS in electrical or engineering management from Cal Poly. So welcome, Ryan. And for audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll work them into the Q&A. With that, let's get things rolling.
Great. We can go to the next slide, please. Just quick disclosures from a legal regulatory framework. Whenever I make public appearances, I can email these to you if you're interested in reading them in detail. I don't encourage it. It's pretty boring stuff. We can go to the next slide. As Gary said, my background, I've been in the industry for 30 years, both on the sell side, where I advise investors on particular stocks in the industry, as well as my industry background developing products, and prior to that with AT&T. We can go to the next slide. So my focus here within my broadband networking sector, which probably comprises about 2/3 of my research work these days, is really in the access network that is connecting content and connecting the network to individual users, whether that's wireline, wireless, satellite, mobile, fixed wireless, cable, you name it. So that's really my wheelhouse, where I've been focused, for the last 30 years, and particularly on the equity research side here now for almost a decade. Next slide, please. So, I think it's a little helpful to reflect on a little bit of history here, because history can teach us some lessons about why things are the way they are. The history of the telephone network is really fundamental here in terms of making universal service available over copper lines. Of course, that in turn created many hundreds of local telecom operators. They eventually consolidated as part of the Bell system, a large part of that. Then we had the breakup of the Bell system, of course, and with the advent of the DSL technology, there was a very large bid in 1996 called the Joint Procurement Consortium, the JPC, that really led to the first major broadband build out in the world over copper. Telecom operators took an early lead there with DSL before cable came to market, and really dominated for the past couple of decades in terms of taking share as the copper DSL technology ran out of juice, essentially. And in the U.S. here, in terms of fiber deployments, our diverse geography certainly is a big challenge and creates a lot of high cost areas relative to other, less dense countries in particular. And then, of course, we have our own political issues in terms of changing heads of the regulatory bodies on the federal level, as well as local regulatory hurdles, such as permitting and digging up streets, and a general resistance to change. So I really feel like the lack of a long-term national policy has really been a hindrance, and the biggest reason why the U.S. is lagging. And over this time, more recently, innovation has driven down PON technology costs tremendously over the last couple of decades, and there's a lot of advances in labor efficiency that make delivering fiber much more cost effective. And the economic advantages, even from a macro perspective, are massive and compelling in terms of the GDP impacts of deploying fiber. Next slide. So, we've seen some shifting federal policy, obviously in a very positive way here, with $100 billion roughly in new programs. There were some historical bipartisan programs that were, such as the Rural Utility Service, the CAF funds, the broadband stimulus, and then we had the RDOF several years ago. I really feel like, for the most part, up until more recently, these programs were really sized for kind of copper upgrades, and they were kind of incremental to service high cost areas and helping subsidize a lot of these rural deployments. And so with a number of these new initiatives, namely the ARPA and the IIJA in 21, we really now have a substantial funding to close this digital divide for the 20% of homes that lack broadband. So these are coming to market. We are, I think, challenged with, you know, the rate at which these programs roll. They are federal programs, and we involve lots of government and regulation and process. And so, you know, relative to, I think, traditional high-tech industry speeds, these programs, you know, in some ways, from investor perspective, I can tell you that, you know, patience is generally thin in the stock market, and, you know, it really takes a long-term perspective to really, you know, keep your hat on in the right direction here. You know, clearly objective here is making ubiquitous broadband for all as defined by the FCC. You know, it's vital for our economic infrastructure, and the pandemic really shined a light on how critical broadband is for, you know, functioning household in our country in terms of, you know, remote work and education, health services, et cetera. And the fact that the U.S. ranks, you know, 31st in fiber access today is, you know, somewhat embarrassing, and I hopefully a gap that we're going to close, you know, over the next, you know, 5 to 10 years. Next slide, please. So, you know, what are some of the implications of this new policy and these funding programs? I think it's interesting to look at relative to the past. Starting with number one, you know, the cable operators are truly now invited to the funding party. And I think for many years, cable it was viewed as a video first platform, and as they have pivoted their focus to broadband and the consumer behavior has shifted away from linear programming to over the top and on demand streaming, it's really kind of leveled the playing field there. And we're seeing now the cable operators participate in a lot of these awards and using fiber to build out adjacent new service areas to what they're doing. This of course coincides with their own adoption of new DOCSIS technology, DOCSIS 3.1, and the changing architecture there. DOCSIS 3.1 is really the signal format, and there's also a pretty massive physical change in the network where they're going to both distributed access architecture, where the DOCSIS modem moves out into the network, as well as virtualization of the CMTS core. So moving from a hardware to a software domain, much like has happened across the data center market and the telecom market, is also impacting the cable market. So they are happy new participants, I think, in this industry. We're also seeing a lot of new entrants enter the market here as well, as far as operators go. Municipalities, power co-ops, and overbuilders have been, you know, big players and becoming bigger and bigger players every year. And this new model of a wholesale open model, which we've heard about more recently in some of the other FBA sessions, is really interesting in terms of the open access model, I think. Another big implication is keeping our eyes on what's going on in the wireless domain. And you know, fixed wireless, I think for much of the past couple of decades has had its fits and starts in trying to, you know, keep up with the speeds that fiber and wireline can provide, and I think it's been a struggle. So they've been kind of relegated to the edge outs, and now in the very high cost areas. And now with funding coming into fiber, it's very interesting to see some of these fixed access players also pivot now, in terms of the technology providers, pivot now to also offer their own fiber access platforms as they see funding come into this area. But I will point out though that there are some next gen fixed wireless access technologies that are coming to market here in real time here this year and next that sound quite impressive and talk about gigabit size capabilities downstream. The fact that there are new ASICs coming to market that were custom developed for fixed wireless, as opposed to repurposing either a Wi-Fi chipset or a 5G mobile chipset for fixed wireless, I think has the potential to raise the game and make fixed wireless a real player here. When you think about 5G and repurposing, in essence, excess 5G spectrum, I'm a little less bullish on that area. I think that what we're seeing happen now on the 5G front is a decline in investment this year. It's actually a pretty radical decline. I don't know if you saw Ericsson's results last week, but their North American sales were down over 40% year over year, which is right in line with what I've been expecting, that 5G radio, the RAN investment is in big decline. And the biggest reason for that is because the new 5G core is still not stood up. And the 5G core was envisioned as a platform that which enterprises could develop new services over. And it's a multi-vendor, new virtualized solution. So it's seen many years of delays, and there's no real line of sight, I would say now, to when the new 5G core is definitely going to be operating in full feature set. So, I think it's going to be attractive for very, very low end users that don't see need for streaming and things like this. T-Mobile's been pretty aggressive out there, but I don't think it's a viable competitor in my opinion with fiber. Next slide. So, a lot of excitement about fiber installation and record years of the last several years that the FBA has done a great job, and hats off to Gary for representing the whole industry and getting some incredible things accomplished at the FBA. So a lot of investor excitement, particularly last year. We saw some stocks really outperform in 22, and coming into 23, we saw some real pullbacks in these stocks and some disappointing bookings in the first quarter of 23. And I've taken a lot of investor questions about what's happened there, and industry folks are scratching their heads as well. And so to try to shed some light here on what happened coming into 23. So in 22, don't forget, we were still facing a very, very challenging supply chain. And I think a lot of service providers were buying quantities and placing orders out of fear of not having available product from a very tight supply chain. If you recall, ports were clogged, semiconductor production was difficult, and the pandemic had a lot of impacts on global supplies, everything from toilet paper to chips and dip. So, what we saw was customers place very long lead orders, service providers, over 12 months in some cases for many products in order to lock in supply. And what happened was, I think a lot of accumulated product inventory at the end of last year was accumulated for products that were no longer impacted by these supply chain constraints. So just as supply started opening up, the operators kept operating under the old model of buy anything you can. And what we saw was that customer prem equipment and fiber optic cable and fiber connectivity products were accumulated, I would say, in excess of what was really needed as supply started opening up. In addition to that, we saw a handful of service providers, tier 1 and tier 2 providers in the US primarily, have some modest misses on their targets for number of homes passed last year. They kept raising the bar, trying to do more and more every year, and some of them missed their targets. I think the biggest impacts on these, they were not massive misses to the tune of 10-20%, I would say, on average. But what we saw was that permitting by local municipalities, it became a big challenge in terms of executing and increasing the velocity of installs. Labor costs, of course, were a major concern. Inflation, just general inflation on parts and services in general. And in addition, we saw some inefficiencies of operators at scale, which is my way of saying the left hand is not talking to the right hand. So many of these service providers, as a result of that, reduced their targets in 23, and this all contributed to inventory holdings in this year that sound like they're going to last for a little while, and it really became a challenge for a number of suppliers. So deployment numbers we still hear are ramping, from reports out of the operators, but these inventories result in this procurement pause for a number of products at tier 1 and tier 2 operators. And I think we're going to see, beginnings of a restart in second half 23, but probably not get to a full normalization of demand until 24. And that's a challenge for some of these stocks and some of these companies as they navigate this. I think a lot of folks were surprised. A lot of these inventories were held at the customer, and for most of these suppliers, they don't have that visibility of what's at the customer until it's a problem. Next slide, please. So, in general, we still remain very, very bullish in our multi-year view of the sector, despite some of the pullbacks in these stocks. I'll just point out it's a really tough market. The investor patience, as I mentioned earlier, is very thin, very, very trigger happy, and a lot of panic at the hint of any kind of bad news these days. These federal subsidy programs, they are slow and methodical. I personally have been hearing about increasing bookings coming from RDOF and ARPA. Probably not going to have a material impact on supplier revenues until 24, just because these long lead times. Fiber in general, though, I would say we view as the long-term winner, of course, with DOCSIS and fixed wireless. Fixed wireless definitely going to have an impact, over the coming years. I think we will see a steady shift in spend away from DOCSIS, away from fixed wireless, over into fiber. But it's going to be many years, I think, where DOCSIS and fixed wireless still remain relatively healthy. So with that, we can open up for questions. Gary, if you have any from the audience.
Hey, Ryan, thanks so much. This is, right, a great perspective, and thanks for addressing kind of the softness we saw in the first half this year. That's really, I get lots of questions about that, is what's going. But what's interesting is our researchers are saying is our deployment is, we're still on track to surpass last year in deployment. So deployment's still going like that. It's just really the inventory correction. It seems to be the issue, and just when is that going to come around? But let me start with, you talked about $100 billion in federal subsidies. It looks like, we started out with somewhere similar to that number on private CapEx investment from the tier ones and tier twos and cable, and everybody trying to get ahead of this before all the fiber federal funding comes in. What are you seeing there on the private side?
Yeah, it's interesting. CapEx in general, there's been a lot of consternation about that, I would say, from an investor perspective and messaging from the larger operators. I think sentiment in the fiber industry is impacted by what I talked about on the 5G front, which is some of the suppliers, let's say guys that sell test equipment to the fiber side and the wireless side. I think they're seeing a lot of weakness from wireless. They're not necessarily calling that out, but it's resulting in negative sentiment. On the CapEx side specifically, we are seeing declines in wireless, and I think we're seeing a shifting in the buckets away from wireless over into wireline. I think more than ever, the view is that the first fiber operator there is, if they've got a solid product, they're going to have an advantage, obviously, over the second and third builders. So it's somewhat of a race to build out. There's one particular tier one. I don't want to say names here, but they had some real cash flow challenges over the last few quarters, and CapEx has been very, very tight. They're one of the bigger fiber builders here in the U.S. Where I'd say the balance of the market, CapEx is healthy on the wireline front, despite, I think, a lot of hand wringing by investors and just general industry concerns about CapEx. So we're seeing operator CapEx, I think, remain steady and shifting of buckets within that CapEx budget. And we're also seeing, new private equity coming in a lot of cases. I've met a few folks even at the Western region event you hosted. So it's nice to see some of these, public-private partnerships come together that really have an opportunity to, for investors, have a nice long-term viewpoint on how strategic fiber investment is.
I was kind of caught by surprise at how 5G fell off a cliff. Right after our Austin event, I went over and I had to give a talk at the big 5G event in Austin, and it was a ghost town. And I was like, man, this died. And then you start seeing all the RAN reports coming out that everything's really falling off a cliff. So is that going to rebound, or?
No, it eventually will. I think the first build out, the first 5G phase of build over the last few years was focused on coverage and then slowly adding capacity where you need that. And so the real kind of golden chalice of 5G that becomes this enterprise IoT play has really lagged. And so in essence, there are no new 5G revenues at all today. It's an absolute zero. It is just straight across from 4G. So the operators, I think, are, reassessing their plans because there was supposed to be a new set of revenues coming in that were enterprise driven. And there's something called network slicing that was kind of created for the 5G environment. I think could eventually be applied to other parts of the network. But that's one of the key elements of the 5G core that's not coming anytime soon. That is a reason why the 5G spend is down. So in one sense, I think it creates some negative sentiment for the industry. But I would also point out it's an opportunity for the fiber industry to flex their muscles if we can get costs under control. I think costs of fiber are probably, one of the biggest challenges here, from a regulatory perspective, and you got the labor costs as well. That those are some of the bigger challenges I think that the fiber industry needs to take on. I think the FBA does a great job of that, but this just needs to keep driving that message home.
Well, hopefully with all the fiber infrastructure we're going to put across the nation and between now and the end of the decade, that will just kind of help put some more wind back into 5G sales, 6G, because obviously we all like our little cell phones and stuff. So yesterday, Wall Street Journal front page, AT&T stock dropped to the lowest point in 30 years, way down by the legacy lead cable issue. How big a deal is this, and is this going to really cause some negative impact to what we're all trying to accomplish here?
As usual, I think the stock market overreacts to everything, good and bad. I've done some of my own diligence and talked to some real experts in this area. Lead cable stopped being deployed in the 1960s. So it's not something that's out there in massive quantities, but it is still out there. It was heavily used in underwater cable across lakes and bays and rivers and these sorts of things. I think my checks indicate that the operators are very much on top of this issue, that they evaluate the integrity of these cables. That doesn't mean there's not going to be rare instances of exposure and liability, but my perspective is I don't view this as a major problem. I think it's in line with kind of business as usual, to be honest. I think that it's certainly on the be on the front page of the Journal. It's got every CEO's attention right now, so they're going to go do the sharpen their pencils and reevaluate exactly the status of all the lead cable that's out there, but they know exactly where it is. I think a couple of the operators have come out in the last 24 hours or so and given an exact detail of how much cable they have out there. And from their perspective, they think it's safer to leave it where it is than actually pull it out. Because the cost of not just the cost, but the environmental impact of removing it could be worse than leaving it in place. So I think it's a pretty much an overblown situation, and I suspect we'll get back to business as usual here in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I get some comments from our audience saying that some remediation strategies will be developed, so you really don't have to even remove the old cable. But again, it's just one of those things that could be a disruptor. But all right, so last question. What do you view as the biggest challenge facing our industry over the next 2 years?
Yeah, I think we hear a lot about permitting, local permitting, and try to streamline that. I think just keeping up the good fight in terms of how important fiber is for economic infrastructure. A lot of cities are on board with that, but I'm sure there are still folks out there whose jobs depend on enforcing the legacy rules from the last 30 years and how you dig up streets and how much time it takes. And so I think streamlining of permitting is really important. Availability of labor is probably the next. I suspect that the inflationary pressures both on labor costs and kind of other materials costs is what is kind of past its peak. We're hearing good financial news on a daily basis, at the federal level here in the U.S. So I'm hoping that inflation doesn't get in the way of this, and I really think that's my view at this point, that we're through the worst of it. So yeah, I would say permitting and availability of labor, and some of the great work that the FBA is doing on to onboard new fiber optic technicians is just awesome. And I think that's a tremendous movement for the industry. So thanks for that, Gary.
Well, certainly on our public policy, term permitting is at the top of the list. So we are camped out at House Energy and Commerce, and trying to make some progress there. So Ryan, thanks. I really appreciate. It's great to see you in Tahoe, and thanks for taking time out of your time in Bend, Oregon. Enjoy your time there, and we'll see you in Orlando in a few weeks.
Sure will.
And I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hope you get back together next Wednesday at Five for Breakfast. We're going to be talking to John Gabriel on the Center for Employment Opportunities, as we talked about labor is so critical. We'll be discussing a fair chance hiring with conviction. So you're not going to want to miss that. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you guys next Wednesday.